Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, the podcast to help you grow as a leader and build a better culture. This is a special episode called Ask Us Anything, and it's something we haven't done in a while. Okay, we reach out to our listeners through the newsletter, through Twitter, and through Instagram, and we ask for questions, and then we just answer them. Well, we got so many questions, and we were kind of excited to talk about these questions. They were so good, so interesting, that we ended up breaking this into two parts. So today's episode is going to cover 4 questions. The first is working with the old school fear-based coach. Secondly, working with players who are toxic on the court or the field. Thirdly, some ways to grow participation numbers in your program. And the last question we're going to tackle today is how to coach a perfectionist. For any first-time listeners, my name is JP Nerbun, and I'm joined today by my friends and co-hosts, Nate Sanderson and Betsy Butterick. In addition to this podcast, I'm the founder of TOC, which supports leaders and their teams to build extraordinary cultures through one-on-one coaching, consulting, online training, and speaking. Learn more about TOC and subscribe to our newsletter at tocculture.com to get the coaching notes to this podcast, as well as our weekly article in Culture Builder. To learn more about Betsy, who is a communication specialist and coach as well, go to betsybutterick.com. All right, so let's get this kicked off here with our first question of Ask Us Anything. The first question we had submitted from coaches, I'm going to be honest, it's definitely one that raises my blood pressure a little bit, this topic. But here's the question. How do you tell coaches that the old school way of coaching is detrimental long-term? And this coach clarified by saying some examples of old school coaching are yelling, punishing with push-ups or other physical conditioning. Whenever a player does something wrong, like not clapping when we blow the whistle during warm-ups, or talking when the coach is talking, or not having their foot behind the line. How do you help the coach understand that it may be our approach to coaching that is the problem and that it's not this generation of soft kids? Well, I think this is a great question. This is obviously one that we do a lot of work in this space. You know, we're trying to actually help some of the old school coaches out there find a better way. And I think that's one thing that I often start with, which is, hey, when you talk to coaches about the way they're currently doing things, it's not to say always that that's bad, even though in this case it may actually be bad coaching, but you're just trying to explore that question that James Clear gave me so many years ago on the Coaching Culture podcast, which is just to ask coaches, what are the chances that the first way you learned how to coach or the way that you're currently coaching is the best way? And the answer is there always is a better way. And so while old school coaching can be effective in the short term, we're really trying to talk about long-term benefits. So how do you help those coaches that are struggling with that to see that? One thing is just to say, hey, what do you want for your players 5 to 10 years from now? Just asking them that question. Do you want them to have to be in the workplace and people have to yell at them or threaten them to do their job, to do it well, to show up with a good attitude? The answer is always no, right? We want something better for our kids. So we're trying to develop them to have the skills to be able to self-regulate, to develop work ethic. And so if we rely on short-term, the punishment, the stick, those extrinsic motivators, that fear-based coaching, we're moving farther away from that intrinsic skill-based coaching. So that's definitely one thing that I think is just really important to have a conversation. So the other big thing I would offer here is this. I think a lot of us as coaches, we want to be demanding. We want to be tough coaches. And that's a good thing. Like the best coaches in our lives are often the ones that demanded the most, our best. They pushed us, they challenged us. We don't have to sacrifice that type of coaching. So when we're asking a coach that to consider a different way of coaching, if we can invite them and give them the tools to be demanding without being demeaning, we can show them that, hey, you can still be tough. You can still hold your players accountable. In fact, you're going to be even a tougher coach because you're going to be intentional. You're going to come into those moments and you're going to be really calling them up to a higher standard consistently every day with this approach. When we can equip coaches with the right skills and tools, then they're more likely to jump at that. Because the reality is a lot of coaches, they're not going to give up on the fact that they want to be demanding, that they want to have high standards in their programs. And they shouldn't, because when you do that, you're really kind of giving up on kids in so many ways. So I would say my second big thing is really just trying to make sure that we're equipping them with that better way, not just saying, hey, the way you're doing it's wrong, but we got to show them the better way.
Yeah, and I would add to that, JP. And again, this is a struggle as an educator, as a facilitator, knowing that there is a more effective, let's throw the word better out there, there's a more effective way to coach the young people than many old school coaches currently embody. The biggest challenge that I see is first connection. How do you connect with an old school coach and understand them and understand their frustrations about kids these days before you ask that old school coach to change? Because in their mind, they're not the one that needs to change. It's the kids that need to change. They need to get in line. They need to be X, Y, and Z. If I'm working with an old school coach, one of the first things I'll typically do is ask them to share with me their current frustrations about kids these days. And they're going to rattle off without fail a litany of things. And then I'll ask them, tell me about yourself when you were playing. Like, what kind of athlete were you? Because often there's that comparison between who I'm coaching today and who I was when I was playing. And then I'll typically summarize and say, it sounds like if you had it your way, you would like to see kids be a little more like how you were as a player. And they'll typically say yes. And I'll say, great, let's talk about how you can create that change in your program without sacrificing who you are as a coach. From there, the conversation is really about creating greater ease, easing the frustration of the old school coach, easing the experience of the current athletes by, as you mentioned, JP, equipping that coach with tools to help them be more effective. Most old school coaches that I know really want to win. And so even if I take out that first part of connecting with their frustration, connecting with their comparisons, if I just start from that premise of you're an old school coach, and if I know old school coaches, they love winning. Is that true for you? Yes, great. Let's talk about how you can be more effective with today's athletes so that you can hopefully win more games. That's something most old school coaches are interested in or can get behind without having to first set them up for here's how you can help kids these days. I don't want to help kids. I want to, it's like, okay, great. So here's how you can win more, coach. When I present tools for better quality coaching through that lens, it's typically easier for some old school coaches to receive. And then inevitably at some point, as they're doing the work, the frustration comes up of, well, why should I have to change? Like, why should I have to, change who I am and how I've been doing things for decades just to please kids these days? To which I try to redirect and say, it's not about pleasing kids these days, although we could argue that happy athletes tend to perform better. And we know there's research and data, enough of it now to say that a fear state is not a flow state. So if we're looking to optimize performance, it benefits you to use some of these tools. And in the long term, it's much easier for you as one person to shift or change than it is to change an entire roster of young people. So let's start with you. What are some small shifts that you can make to enable you to be that old school coach that you want to be while being more effective with the athletes that you're coaching?
Yeah, JP, when I first saw this question come through, I thought, I have zero experience of really connecting well with an old school traditional type coach and, helping them move more to a transformational perspective, maybe with some more modern coaching, practices. So this is all theoretical for me, but I think two things that come to mind quickly, one is just a conversation that TJ Rosine often has at Point Guard College when he's doing coaching clinics is to really challenge coaches at the end. And I know we've referenced this rocking chair kind of perspective, right, on our career before. But TJ tries to connect in a way of saying, how do you want to be remembered? And oftentimes I think an old school coach wants to be remembered the way that they were coached because they saw that as that was successful for them, similar to what Betsy said. Um, but he does a great job of pushing on, well, what did that feel like? And both being able to tease out the positives when I felt challenged and inspired and pushed, but also maybe times where, not that it went too far, you're not trying to find, abusive coaching behaviors here, but maybe where I could have felt better in my experience as a player and how. And I think when you're having a conversation with someone, you're trying to get them to change their mindset a little bit, you're just looking for that opening, that perspective on whether, as Betsy said, what it was like for them as a player or what they'd like to be remembered by or what their ultimate purpose is or what's going to make this worthwhile at the end of the day anyway. Is it 500 wins? Is it impacted lives? And just sort of starting to explore some of that territory a little bit to see if you can find something to grab onto and further a conversation to start reflecting on, well, are there better ways to accomplish that mission if that's truly what we want, what impact we want to have, what experience we want to create for kids these days?
The next question we have says, I have one kid who's having trouble buying into the culture standards and makes everyone on the team feel like he doesn't like them while on the court, and unfortunately has a magnetic personality off the court. What are the best ways to gain trust and to get him to buy in? Looking at the wording of this question, the thing that stood out to me was the unfortunately, and the way that I interpret the wording there is it's a challenge to address the behavior of an individual who's being reinforced by success, in this term, pure social success, outside of practice. So this guy makes people feel like, they're insignificant or irrelevant during practice, but off the court, people love him. So it's a challenge to be like, hey, you need to change your behavior, because that kid can easily be like, why? Like, I have all these friends, my teammates love me off the court. For me, this comes to a question of framing. How do we frame to the individual who has the inability to connect in a really positive way with their teammates on the court? How do we frame our request for them to modify their behavior in a way that is motivating? So I'll give an example. A player that I coached years ago, same situation. People didn't really like her on the floor. Off the floor, she was great. On the floor, she could be pretty demanding. There were other words and adjectives that were associated with her kind of behavior. And she was very good. And so she was on the floor a lot, which as a coach was a challenge. The conversation I had with her is, tell me what's most important to you. When you're on the court, when you're playing, what's the most important thing? She's like, Betsy, I really want to win. And that's why I yell at my teammates, because I know where they need to be in order for us to win. And in my head, I'm like, okay, that is a very healthy perspective for you to have. I don't know it's always true for your teammates, but let's work with this. She wanted to win. And so the conversation I had with her is, okay, if you want to win, then you need the most support possible from your teammates. So even though you have the ability to go one-on-one and score at will, if you were to pass the ball out and they were to pass it around, that's going to draw the defense away from you, so that by the time you get it back, it's easier to score. So that was one example of how getting her to do something she didn't want to do because she wanted to win actually facilitated an increased likelihood of her getting that result, while also giving her teammates more of what they wanted and needed from her as well. So for me, I think, okay, coach challenge, how do you shape behavior? How do you make that request to change the behavior in a way that also works for or is motivating for that individual as well?
I think another perspective on that question, Betsy, and this maybe is a little counterintuitive too, but it reminds me of Wright Thompson's article on Caitlin Clark. And just the past year, he had almost unrestricted access to the Iowa women's basketball team, and following Caitlin Clark around and talking to her high school coaches and her parents and her teammates and her college coaches. And there's a lot of instances where if you were just looking at the film of Caitlin Clark's reaction to bad calls or teammate mistakes or turnovers, whether it's in high school or in college, you might say, goodness gracious, she's not living up to the standards of the program or what we would expect as a coaching staff. And when I read that article, and I know Caitlin's high school coach really well, there was a certain aspect of, we have to accept her as she is, in a sense. Like, she's an alien that competes at a different level than anybody else. She has higher standards and expectations than everybody else. And that's not going to change. Like, her nature's not going to change. So it's not an excuse for her to berate teammates on the floor or officials, or, make an ass of herself at certain times when she gets frustrated. But I do think there's something there where there needs to be some grace for that player as well, and that there are some players that just aren't going to fit neatly into our expectations of what all of their behavior should look like on the floor. I don't necessarily know the best way to navigate that, but I do think even conversations with their teammates about, this is this is maybe what part of this ultra competitiveness looks like, and that's good for us too. You talked about that teammate, the star player valuing their teammates and getting them involved, and I think there's a perspective there of valuing the competitiveness that they bring. Sometimes that comes with baggage too, right? And so it's really, again, comes back to the dialogue maybe that a coach can facilitate as much as anything else.
Yeah, and this question led me to a few different places based upon my own experiences. I kind of read this as the player that's maybe talented but lazy, doesn't work hard. Maybe they're competitive, maybe they're not, but gets along with everybody off the court. But people off the court or off the field don't really challenge them on their behaviors on the court, right? So there's that issue. I think both of you made great points. I think the big thing that I would see is I would challenge, unfortunately, and say, hey, maybe that's a place to start. There's a relationship there off the court or off the field that you can work from. But I really think it starts with the player and figuring out, because there's so much that's contextual in this question. But I think the principle that applies is what's getting in the way? What's getting in the way of that player being a good teammate? Is it their view of what leadership looks like on the court? Have they watched too much of, the Michael Jordan, the Last Dance documentary, and they think that's what great competitors are? Is it been your own example on the sideline of challenging and they're just mimicking your behavior? There's so many things that could be getting in the way. They don't have the skills, their natural tendencies, they're more competitive. Like, there's so many things, but what's getting in the way for that individual and helping them to realize the natural consequences of their behavior? Do they have awareness? Without awareness, nobody will ever take ownership. So can we lead them to a place of awareness without just telling them, but asking reflective questions? I think, Betsy, you shared some great ones there. I think the other side of this is, okay, how do we work with the team, right? Because this we see so often. The team, everybody gets along great off the court or off the field, but then they're just nobody don't like they don't really like playing with each other, right? Especially the players that aren't meeting the cultural standards. So now we actually have to have a real difficult conversation, and facilitating that. This comes back to a previous episode we just did around effective team bonding. We talked about sometimes it's not just going out and having fun. It's actually having really hard conversations that aren't a lot of fun. That's what maybe needs to happen here, is that we need to facilitate a conversation where there's can be honest sharing.
Well, our next question here is a simple one, and one I think that a lot of coaches struggle with, no matter what your context of your sport is. And that is, what are some effective ways to grow numbers on your team? And full disclosure, we joked about this off air here. Our numbers at Mount Vernon, since I started, we had 28 my first year, and we had 15 9 through 12th grade players out for basketball last year at a 3A school in Iowa, which is maybe doesn't give me the best track record here to answer this question first, but I'll at least talk about how we're trying to approach that. And I think we are making some progress in a couple different ways. So, number one, I think there's two ways to look at this. First of all, from a top down perspective, and then secondly, from a bottom up perspective. So, where we started at Mount Vernon is we just wanted to make sure that we're creating an experience that players look forward to, that it was enjoyable, that they felt welcome, that they felt appreciated, that they felt like they could be themselves. Like, we wanted to create a safe place where they were going to get better at basketball, they were going to make more friends. In other words, like, if we couldn't create a destination that younger players look forward to arriving at someday, then it really didn't matter what we did at the lower levels or in our recruiting. Because if our current players weren't enjoying themselves or weren't proud of what we were doing, it was going to be pretty hard to sell the program to anybody else. So I think you got to start there with what's in your program. And then the other place, especially at a high school level, is the feeder program. I think is essential. And when I got to Mount Vernon, there was no organized youth program at all. Maybe a couple dads here and there picked their kids' friends and they went out and created a travel team. And that's not a great way to increase your overall numbers at any level. And so we've really built out, I think our philosophy is as many as we can for as long as we can. So we've had almost 20 second graders and 15 third graders and 20 fourth graders. I mean, we've done a lot of work at the lower levels to try to get kids started in the game of basketball, hoping that down the road, 5, 6 years from now, we have classes of 8 to 10 kids that are coming into the high school program rather than 3 or 4. And that's a lot of work. And you may not see the fruit of that labor if you're the one that's starting the program. But I think that's the way it's got to be. You've got to start with where you're at in terms of your high school or your current experience. And you really got to create something that's going to feed from the bottom up.
Yeah, for me, I think it really starts with really knowing why kids are there. Like, what is their why? Why do they want to play? And obviously, the answer, one of the top answers is to have fun. But what makes it fun for different individuals? And that can be different for different players, right? Some players are more concerned with improvement, chasing certain goals, winning, and others are looking for a social experience. And you can be in a lot of programs for both of those individuals. And you can work with those individuals and within the team to help, provide those experiences for everyone and be respectful and honor and set standards at work. But there's some programs that you're going to have to be a little bit more selective, right? And certain individuals that are looking for a social experience, you may not be for them. And that's okay, right? And I think we often cite the drop off in new sports, it drops off at 13 as, it's a really, really scary number, right? The number that drop out. But if I'm a high school coach and I'm running a varsity program and competitive and my job depends on it, it's not my job to fix that issue, right? By having a roster of 40 kids on my varsity basketball team, when it's probably most beneficial to provide a valuable experience at around 12 to 15, potentially even less, right? To be competitive, to provide playing time experience. It's on schools, it's on the community to provide other teams. So there's a little bit of a tangent there, but I think that's just one thing I think is it's not on every coach to fix that issue that we have in sports participation drop off. I think the other thing to remember is as coaches, we probably do more to keep players from coming out than bring them. It's other players on our team that are our recruiters. So make sure you're not doing anything that is a obvious, like, I don't want to go play for that guy. He's a jerk, right? Do things that create the conditions for good things to happen and a positive experience in your program. But then you really have to empower your players within your program to go out there and say, hey, we're doing something special here. We're building something here. We want you to be a part of this, right? They have to be taking ownership to create fun experiences outside of the team, practices and stuff. Like they need to take some ownership of that too. When they do that, then your numbers often will go up and you'll be bringing the right players for the right reasons.
The last thing I'll add on that topic, and for anyone listening who's looking to build numbers, I think Nate, you and JP have added a lot of value to the variety of ways that they can do that. What you just mentioned, JP, about our student athletes are our best recruiters, like, hey, we're building something special, we're doing something fun. I would add to that, the parents of the kids in your program are your best recruiters, because parents talk all the time. And whether it's a high school team you're looking to build numbers for, but their child also plays on a club team with a variety of kids, and the parent says, oh, my kid's having a terrible experience. And they're like, oh, my kid loves their coach. Like those conversations can absolutely build numbers in the background. So something to keep in mind as well.
And just really quickly, JP, I think one thing that's really helped me understand this landscape a little bit better is like just the coaching environment is different than it was when I started 20 years ago because kids have so many more other activities that they can do. And so it's not just, am I choosing between, doing nothing in the winter and playing basketball? Now there's club volleyball and, off-season softball, and there's girls wrestling in Iowa. And like, there's so many more things that they can do. And so it's just a more competitive environment for their time and for their attention and for their effort. And I just say that because sometimes as coaches, we feel like it's my fault. A kid quits the program, it's because of me. We personalize that. And in a lot of times, we're doing exactly what you described. We're doing the best that we can to create the circumstances for good things to happen. And a kid chooses to do something else with their time. And I'm learning to have more peace with that. It's a little bit more difficult, world to navigate than it was when we started. But I think that's important to recognize is it's a highly competitive environment. And it's not always your fault if a kid decides not to play your sport.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, Nate. Appreciate that one. Next question we have is how do you support a player who is a perfectionist but also negates or rejects positive praise? When I read that question, I'm thinking, all right, you got potentially an athlete that deals with perfectionism and potentially one that struggles to take compliments. Those could be the same thing, or they could be a little bit different. I think I would look at four things when I was thinking about this question. The first is, first off, are you doing affirmations or are you just doing praise? And when we think about affirmations, we're focusing on the behaviors and the process. So it's not about, hey, great shot today, or well done, you scored 20 points. It's pointing out what they did to shoot well, or that shot well. Was it getting their feet set, or was it, hey, you've been working so hard in practice lately? So you're pointing out the behavioral type of thing. So we should really move away from praise and more to affirmations, which are behavioral focused rather than outcome focused. The second thing is try just giving less of those things, even less affirmations. Maybe that doesn't really move the needle for that individual. So try asking questions. One of the best things we can do is, well, hey, how do you think you played today? What are you proud of? Or if they do play, hey, you had a big game there. That was, phenomenal performance. Or, oh, how are you feeling about it? So you're asking questions to bring them into some reflection. And then if you still are sensing this perfectionism tendencies, hypercritical themselves, then I would just share, hey, this is something I'm observing in you, which is You're very, very critical of yourself. You don't seem to take compliments well. What do you think of that? And just have a conversation, because what is getting in the way for that athlete, where that comes from, it could probably be different for everybody. I'm actually not very good at taking compliments. I'm very quick to brush them off and point something out critical of myself, right? So this is something at my age I'm still working at. And so this could be something that's just a continuous conversation to work with that athlete on, which is just even saying, getting them to be better at saying, "Hey, thanks, coach. I appreciate it." Like, just that may be the skill they need to start to develop. And we're working with them on that skill.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you touched on asking questions, JB, because when someone rejects compliments or rejects statements, it- the the most effective pivot that I've seen is to go to asking questions. So even if we thought something was great, instead of saying, "Hey, great, way to get your feet set," was an example that you used. We could ask them like, "How did you feel about your base today when you were shooting?" "Oh, I thought it was pretty stable." "Yeah, and it seemed like you shot well because of it." And we can hesitate and not put on that great job. Just say like, "Yeah," just leave it as factual. When I hear this question, two things come to mind for me are fear-based and I'll say opposite sides of the same coin. So fear of failure, that perfectionism is, I want to do things perfectly or do them exceptionally well, so I avoid or minimize failure. But then the rejection of compliments also sometimes suggests a fear of success. Like if I'm doing this thing really well, now there's a pressure or an expectation to keep performing at that level or higher. And because I'm a perfectionist, it's always going to be higher. And gosh, I feel really stressed or tapped out or kind of at my limit already. So for me, it's when I hear this question in this context, it's almost a balancing act of I want to get better, I want to perform, I want to be as close as I can to perfect, and I'm going to reject the things that show that I'm on that path, because if I'm arriving there, then oh my gosh, what next? So that's kind of what I hear in this as well.
And I think these questions, we never really know exactly what the context is, right? And so when I read this and I hear this question, I'm reminded of a Dina Evans did a presentation that she's another point guard college reference here today, but on confidence back in the day, and she was talking about how a player could go 9 for 10 from the field in a game, and what's the shot that they remember most on the way home? It's the one that they missed. Right. And I think there's something about the way that our attention is attuned. Sometimes that's because of the parent influence, and that's all the parents talk about. So that's what I'm trained, sort of my mind is trained to give attention to. And sometimes that's just high expectations for self. And, there's lots of ways that that could manifest. I think one thing that's been valuable for some of our players in the past is just doing a confidence journal, like forcing them to write down 10 things that they saw themselves do well without qualifiers. Not I did this, but could have. It's just 10 things where we're trying to retrain their radar a little bit to recognize the good things that they do, that they are doing, to balance that out. And sometimes my voice is part of that process. Sometimes the film that we show is part of that process. Um, and I think another thing when it comes to receiving compliments, and this may sound silly, but just practicing receiving compliments, like we're going to do Valentine's at the end of practice and we're going to pair up, and I want you to give something to your neighbor, they're going to give something to you, and when they give you a compliment, you cannot justify it, you cannot say yeah but, you just have to look them in the eye and with the most sincerity in your heart say thank you. And I'm telling you, people haven't been taught how to do that. Like we don't do that on a regular basis. And so even just making something silly out of it, where we're going to learn how to receive compliments from one another, it might open a door to a greater conversation. It might make that a little bit more comfortable for everyone.
All right, that's it for part one. Our next episode will be unpacking missing practice and mental health days, which are kind of linked. I will also be unpacking how a coach can kill culture, some tips for coaching new teams and coaching your kids, and we'll share our top 4 things to build a great culture. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Please be sure to share this episode if you found it valuable. Review the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And also subscribe to our weekly newsletter at tocculture.com to get the notes to this in every episode.